Today, my guest is author Peter Ames Carlin, and we're going to be talking to him about the new paperback release from Touchstone, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, of his memoir, Paul McCartney, A Life. It was published in hardcover last year and received very good reviews. Now, Peter is the New York Times bestselling author of Catch a Wave, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson. He's also a former senior writer at People magazine and now works as a culture reporter for the Oregonian newspaper. He lives with his family in Portland, Oregon. Well, Peter, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, this is going to be a wonderful interview. Certainly, there's no one out there that doesn't enjoy the Beatles. But, I think the first question that I'd like to ask you in the PR material that I received, it says that this is an unauthorized bio. Could you explain to the listeners what is meant by an unauthorized bio?
Sure. Generally, if a book is authorized by whoever the subject is, that means that person, the subject of the book, has had some editorial oversight over what is and isn't published.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the worst case scenario.
Right.
There are certain people who will just say, look, go ahead and do whatever you want. Like, I know you, I trust you, this sounds like a great idea, boom, go ahead and do whatever you want to do.
Sure.
And that's kind of obviously the best case scenario. The book I did a couple of years ago about Brian Wilson, for instance, wasn't authorized, but they, in any official sense, but they did give me that sense of just come on down and hang out. And,
that must have been fun.
Yeah, it was great. And it was like clear and it was just like, if I had trouble getting somebody to talk who said like, well, I don't know, I like to do this with Brian's permission. And I'm like, great, go ask him, or here's his manager's number, give her a ring. She knows what I'm up to. She's been helping me get to people. So
yeah, that sure makes a writer's life easier. Now, how long did it take you to do the research for this book, and what sources did you examine and use?
Well, in terms of the time thing, I mean, in some ways I have to date it back to 1966, because that's when I was a little kid who, whose parents came home with Revolver, and I was hypnotized by that, and was a huge Beatle fan. It was like my defining thing through adolescence. And then you move on and you learn to take on, find other kinds of art and artists and fall in love with them as well. But so I was always collecting stuff, and I bought the books when they came out, and if there was a good, article in a magazine, I'd buy it, and I tend to hang on to that kind of stuff, which is great, because when it was time for me to start this process, I knew that I already had like 2 banker's boxes just full of Beatles and Paul McCartney related stuff, plus, a dozen or a dozen and a half different Beatle books. So I was very well acquainted with the literature, and a lot of what I did over about I think it was the year and a half that I was working on the book was just try to connect with as many people who knew Paul, who had worked with Paul, from his childhood on till today, and also dig through the other, especially contemporaneous accounts and interviews that the guy, that Paul would have given, from the Beatle days and the Wings days and all that, because it seems like the latter day stuff that comes out is well, like he sort of, everyone I think does, but he has a whole lot of very standard anecdotes and stories and revelations that he'll like to talk about.
So it took you a year and a half. Now the hardcover came out last year. So when did you actually start the process then? When did you know you were going to do this book? And did you just make the decision to do it, or did a publisher ask you to write it?
Oh, well, I went to when you sign a book contract with anybody, they one of the clauses is that they have a first look at whatever your next project is going to be, and they can either, and if they decide to pay, to bid on it, or to, offer money for it, then the onus is on the writer to find someone else who might give him a better deal.
Uh-huh.
So this time around, I mean, it's actually not the same publishing house that I had with the Brian Wilson book, but my editor had moved on to Simon and Schuster, and he knew I was working on this, and so when it got to him, he kind of did business really quickly. And he's the same guy who's editing the book I'm working on now.
Okay. All right. So, did you offer it to the publisher in the forms of a proposal, or did you say, "Hey, I'm starting work on this book, and are you interested?" And is that how it works?
Oh, it was basically a proposal.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, my first book proposal I wrote was like 25,000 words. It contained significant chunks of the book.
Right.
But then, you know, they got to know me and liked what I'd done before. So it's like that, you know, you build up a level of trust. So, you know, I could sell my second book on like a 2-page letter, and the third book was just a telephone conversation.
Yes, isn't that wonderful? You're to that point. Well, let's get into the whole thing about Paul. Go back to the beginning and describe what was he like when he met John Lennon. Talk about his personality, but specifically growing up and when he met Lennon and started with the group, and then what was the commonality that bonded them that you talk about in the book?
Well, just for a little bit of background, I mean, Paul was born in a working class, kind of lower working class family. His mom was a nurse, and his dad worked in the cotton industry, which had fallen onto very hard times. So they grew up without a lot of money, but with a whole lot of love in the family and a big extended family all around. But when Paul was 14, his mom died of breast cancer, and that clearly left a huge scar on the guy.
Of course.
And at which point he turned all his attention into music and his guitar, and just finding a way to express the things he couldn't say, or finding a place that that took his mind off of everything else, was an escape. And John Lennon was growing up just about a mile away in a much nicer neighborhood that was across a golf course from where Paul grew up. Both of them in the suburbs south of Liverpool, England, in the northwest corner of that country. They met, and it was a little skidgy at first because I think they both probably smelled, talent and ambition in one another. But it wasn't long before John invited Paul, who hadn't been in a band ever, to join a band that he had formed called the Quarrymen, which was made up of kids he'd gone to school with. John's thing, both of his parents were alive at the time, but his dad had vanished on a merchant marine vessel years earlier, never to return. And his mother, Julia, was just not quite settled down enough to really take on John. So she passed him to her sister, Mimi, and Ray, who was, loving but very firm and stern, and she raised John. And so in some ways they were very, very different guys. I mean, Paul was more cheery, in a sense charming, and John was very confrontational and kind of, but also had a very warm and loving side, but hid his deepest feelings sort of under this kind of hard, street fighter's shell. But they started playing together in 1957, and eventually, as Paul and John clearly respected Paul's abilities to a great extent, so they ended up, the group just gradually morphed into the band that came to be known as the Beatles. And a lot of it, I think a lot of the power in the band, I mean, it was not only the contrasting sort of flavors of John and Paul's personalities, but also just the way that their different styles of writing and thinking and feeling and playing music.
Right, they were
really sort of complemented one another to a magical degree.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those of the listeners that are just tuning in, I am talking to Peter Ames Carlin about his the paperback release of his memoir, Paul McCartney: A Life. So we're talking about Paul. Now, you said that even at that young age, Paul was charming and friendly, and are those the two outstanding words that you would use to describe him when he was a kid and first met Lennon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, Paul definitely has a more, I mean, everybody has their warm side and their
Mm-hmm.
chillier side, and Paul definitely has his. But talking to kids who went to school with him, grammar school and primary school in England, I mean, the vision you get of 6-year-old Paul on the playground is just this sweet sort of out,
Mm-hmm.
large-eyed, charming young bloke
Cute, yeah,
who the
right.
teachers all fell in love with, really,
Sure.
because he was so easy to deal with. And then when he in high school or primary school, as they call it, at the Liverpool Institute, he was the guy that was sort of the kind of the voice of the classroom. The
Mm-hmm.
guy that could communicate with with the teacher and kind of gently explain the student's position on things and or tease the teacher in a way that made the teacher laugh and not throw him out.
So he showed his leadership abilities at an early age. Now, what is the
Leadership, but also the other interesting thing is also a very just intuitive sense of publicity
uh-huh.
and how to kind of project an image that was going to be as compelling and yet unoffensive to as many people as possible.
So that was an amazing ingrained thing that he had there. Well, let's jump to the present Paul McCartney before we get into other details about it. What is the present Paul McCartney like? You have quite an apt description of him as well in the book.
Well, I think one of the things that impressed me a lot when I was working on the book was how much affection his old friends and colleagues and even people who maybe left McCartney's organization in less than perfect terms, that how loving and protective they are of Paul.
Mm-hmm.
That beneath everything, I mean, he's a remarkably low-key kind of guy. Definitely when he walks around town and stuff, he's not one of these big, I mean, he keeps things on a very human scale. And it was also compelling and important to realize how cool his kids are. That they're all, you don't ever read about young McCartneys getting arrested or throwing champagne bottles out of the sunroofs of limos. They're just not those kind of people, I think, because they were really, Paul and Linda raised their kids with just with the stark emphasis being on we are ordinary people.
Mm.
And Dad has this job and this is what it requires, but other than that, we make our own dinners, we do our own dishes, and it's just middle class life.
That's really, that says a lot about him also. Well, I saw a copy of a book review that was done, and the person that wrote the book review, I'm looking for his name right here, and Kevin Turner. He does talk about the fact that you do bring out all the good and bad and his use of charm and wit and so forth. But then he does go on to say as he aged, his penchant for complete artistic control, workaholic obsession to detail, and inability to take direct criticism all grew more pronounced. Did you find that in your research? Or
Yeah,
is this just the reviewer?
No, that's definitely, I think, a fair assessment. And the sense is, but on the one hand, the guy is still very open to inspirations and ideas and stuff. But on the other hand, he's stuck in this weird, paradoxical, life that he's had to live since 1970.
Yeah.
As being an ex-Beatle, being somebody who was once, who not only was once the biggest star in the world, but also turned out to be fabulously successful on his own. And after several decades of that, I think it's hard for you to walk into a room and not feel like you're the coolest, smartest person
Well,
there.
of course, and he's entitled at this point to do it.
Yeah. The only problem is that you can hear it sort of that he's not necessarily always the best judge of his best work. And so sometimes you hear stuff that he puts out and you think like, oh my God, like why did he even think that cut them,
And at this point, Peter, what I want to ask you is what you think was the most successful period for the Beatles, and what do you think was Paul's role in that?
Well, there's different kinds of success. I mean, I think people they were never not hugely successful, but
Right.
but creatively as well as commercially. But I think definitely that era from Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, people see that as a real high watermark for them, and a lot of that's what's interesting about that is that a lot of their moving toward avant-garde sounds and really sort of innovative recording techniques came straight out of Paul's interests. He was living in London and spent a lot of time hanging around with underground artists and writers and going to shows and seeing things he'd never seen before, and that obviously opened his eyes and ears.
Right, and then talking about one of their lowest musical points, when they figured they could do anything, they jumped into film. And would you define, as many critics do, their Magical Mystery Tour as one of their lowest musical points, excluding, of course, their breakup?
Well, yeah, again, but musically, it's got a lot of great stuff in it. So, but
yeah, it wasn't well received at the time. So at the time, I think
the film itself is a challenge. It doesn't really have a very clear plot.
No, it doesn't.
They directed it themselves, and it turned out that they had really no strong sense of how to direct it.
Yeah, so I think we'd have to agree that might have been a little down point for them. Let's get to 1970 now, because there's so much we've got to talk about, and so we're going to be jumping. But 1970, Paul was blamed for their breakup, and tragically, it was a terrible misunderstanding. Talk about that, and then what was the real reason that you found for the split?
Well, the confusion about Paul was part of a handwritten Q&A he put into early copies of his first solo record, where he asked himself as an interviewer about different aspects of the Beatles. Were they breaking up? Was it all over? And he kept saying, no. But then finally, toward the end of the interview, he asked himself, did you miss the other Beatles during the recording? And he said, no.
Huh?
And do you foresee a time when they'll be working together again? And he said, no. But I mean, foresee is a very loose word. What does it mean? Like in the next week or two? No.
Right.
In the next year or two? Possibly, sure. But that's not how it was read. People played up that quote about no. I don't see us working together anymore.
Yeah, and then after the split, John and Paul blamed different people for it.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little.
There was a lot of blame, and people continue to sort of play that game. But as far as I can see, I mean, the same thing that made the Beatles great, those conflicting personalities, the different agendas coming together in unexpected ways, was exactly the same force that broke them up in the end.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, somebody in the music industry told me once, he said, take a group, give me a group, and once I make them successful, that's when they break up.
That's it.
Yeah, people just get, I think it's a tough, especially the size of fame they had, it's a very, very tough burden to carry around with you for that long.
Sure it is.
The pressure's intense.
Now, how did the breakup affect Paul, and what do you think was revealed about Paul's personality then?
Well, he was crushed. I mean, that was the terrible irony. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's had this very paradoxical relationship with music and the Beatles in particular. He was the one Beatle. I always call him the most Beatle-y Beatle there is.
I like that, the most Beatle-y Beatle.
Loved that. He loved the acclaim. He loved the image. He liked being part of a family-like situation. And being successful with his best friends was like he just couldn't imagine anything better. But, people change and and grow up and come up with new ideas and new things they want to do. So at I think it was clear to a lot of people that they were going to go their separate ways, like inevitably. And then once John died in 1980 and was kind of elevated to this level of secular sainthood, poor Paul, on the one hand, was grief-stricken by John's death, and I don't know if he's ever really quite gotten over it.
I can't imagine that you do get over something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it had to do with, if his feelings are indeed, still unresolved, which kind of comes through in all the interviews, is it's because on the one hand he loves and cherishes, John and John's memory and the work they did together. But on the other hand, I think there's still a competitiveness between them, and I think he's found that the only thing worse than having a living, breathing, rival is having one who's passed away.
Yes, and like you said, he's kind of been given sainthood, and he was not a saint, and he had his foibles as well.
Sure. A brilliant artist, a great guy in many, many ways, but also, by his own admission, a bit prickly.
Yes, and Yoko was involved there. Well, let's talk about Paul's solo work after the breakup and where it went from there through the 70s.
Okay. Well, he very quickly, after starting with his homemade album right after, at the point of the Beatles breakup, he very quickly got back to being, as commercial an artist as he could imagine being. And made a whole lot of great records, I think, during the 70s. I mean, not all the albums were terrific song for song, but it's amazing how vibrant and alive those Wings songs still feel, even though they were sort of critically disliked at the time.
Right.
Since then, it's interesting. It's kind of album to album. Occasionally, he'll pop out like a brilliant record that makes you realize, oh, this is the guy who was in the Beatles. And then occasionally he'll release records that you listen to them and you think,
Yeah. Well, was it out? You mentioned how he was affected after John's death. Was it after John's death that he created one of his most successful works, Tug of War? Can you elaborate on that? Talk about that.
Sure. Well, he
briefly.
Yes. He wanted to make a record. I mean, I think he felt the need after some critical drubbing to make a record that was really going to be his best work. So he got the Beatles producer, George Martin, to come in and produce it. And he actually, I think, had invited John to come and help out a bit. He always was hoping to write with John again, or at least get his input. And John was coming back. But then John's death, I think, really upped the stakes all that much more, because he knew that whatever he put out was going to be compared directly to John's work. And so he needed to address his, the death and the rivalry and the good and the bad.
Right.
And did a lovely job of it.
Well, and then you bring out in the book too that they were talking about getting back together, and I think it was 1974, if I recall, before John was murdered. But then John got back together again with Yoko, so that ended that. Well, let's now jump to the fact that here's Paul's wife Linda, who's been a part of his musical rebirth, and actually played in a group with him. Was that did she play with him when he was in Wings, or was that in the early start of music when he was on his own?
Linda was in Wings, and she was part of all his music, really. I mean, there were some records that she was maybe less involved in.
Yeah.
But when he toured, she was right there on keyboards.
But did that start with Wings, or did her involvement start earlier?
Well, her involvement, I mean, I think she actually sings on Let It Be.
Uh-huh.
And maybe one or two songs on the White Album, I don't know.
Yeah.
But no, she was, the moment that he broke up, or the moment the Beatles broke up, Paul was very intent on, well, I need a musical partner, and now that's going to be you.
Uh-huh.
And so, and I think he probably remembered the fact that he takes credit for helping John learn how to play the guitar like a guitar instead of like a ukulele, which is what he'd been used to. He figured he would do the same thing with Linda. I can teach you to play the piano, and
right.
I know you can already you can sing harmonies, so this is what we've got.
Well, let's.
And so that's so she became a founding member of Wings
and then tragically died in 1998, and then he rebounded in marriage to Heather Mills. And I thought it was interesting that you say in the book that she was later revealed to be an emotionally unstable, pathological liar. On what was that based? Where did that come from?
I don't know if that was my specific quote. somebody might have said
Somebody
that.
might have said that. I'm not sure. Well, that's why I was wondering if you knew where that came from. And I think that was also in one of the reviews about the book. And I wondered whether you found anything like that in your research, or is this just somebody else's idea? That's kind of pinned on you.
A lot of
book.
stuff, a lot of information sort of leaked out during their terrible divorce proceeding. And I think it was clear for everyone I talked to, dozens and dozens of people who hung out with them and knew them. It just didn't seem like, that she was that none of them seemed to be able to understand exactly what it was that Paul saw in her.
Yeah, when did he actually marry her?
Let's see.
Well, that's all right. I won't hold you to it if you don't remember the date. But it wasn't long after Linda died, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think they married because Linda died in 98.
98.
I think he was married again by 2000 or 2001.
Yeah, really, really fast.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't know whether that's true or not, but just everybody figured that they really couldn't understand why he settled with her, and then we certainly learned a lot about the trouble in their marriage, ongoing trouble. Now, there's so many new facts that you've brought out in the book. I mean, the book is not just a rehash of everything that's been done before. You have brought out some new ideas and things, and I was just wondering what amongst them might have surprised you the most, or did you find the most interesting, or what would you say is maybe one thing that you thought was really great to know?
Well, it was the relationship between John and Paul after the Beatles. I thought was particularly fascinating, and it was really interesting to hear about how, they hung out a lot more than people think that they did, especially in the early 70s, because when John was living in New York and Paul was flying in and out of New York all the time. They just, even in the midst of their horrible, public feuding, they were still getting together for dinner, and hanging out all evening long. And, I think sometimes it was more pleasant than others, but I always thought that was very sweet.
Well, it's kind of like family. I mean, you get together with family, you get along, and then you can have disagreements, but then you still want to get together again. So, that I found that part interesting, what you had to say about it, and so the other interesting thing too, you bring out a lot of about his work, and you. This is something from your material here that I'm looking at too, that you offer tantalizing evidence that the widely accepted Beetle Smith, with McCartney as villain and Lennon as avant-garde genius, requires some revision. I thought that was great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is. It's very easy. You think of John in New York, and you think of him as this wild, kind of uncontrollably avant-garde artist. But a lot of what people, a lot of those really astonishing sounds and work that they did came straight from Paul. Just think of those moments of orchestral anarchy in A Day in the Life, which is John wrote 90% of that song. It's true, but it's the production in a lot of ways that's like one of the most haunting things about it. And the way that there is this weird noise that comes out of nowhere. It's great. And I often wonder too whether the fact that
John's involvement with Yoko and they were on the news so much, being interviewed in their beds and everything, they had to, they're smoking this and doing that and doing something else. That seemed to draw a lot of attention to him and away from the music, and he actually sounded kind of boring at times. Maybe he was just high, I don't know. But I agree with that it's kind of sad that this basically all of these things are mainly coming out now and I suppose hindsight is easy. Well, I'm running out of time. I very quickly want to say that my next guest is going to be Jorn Wither, who was producer of the Beatles reunion on 2020. So you've got to be sure to listen to the show, Peter. And I want to thank you for being here, and good luck with the book.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.